So my in-laws just called to let us know they're on their way over and we're out of food. Great. Luckily, Instacart helps me get groceries delivered in as fast as an hour. Plenty of time to cook an in-law worthy meal. Now, what to make? Chicken parm. Perfect. Download the Instacart app or visit instacart.com to get free delivery on your first order using the code PREPARED22. Now the only thing to worry about is dinner conversation. Offer valid for a limited time. Minimum order $10. Delivery subject to availability. Additional terms apply.
At a time when you need to have more experimentation, structurally you're inhibiting it. So it does a lot of mixed messaging. If I'm a Carter sitting somewhere in Guangzhou or somewhere else, I'm wondering what on earth does he really want me to do? And how do I climb this ladder while being cautious, not making catastrophic mistakes, yet experimenting? So it's a really difficult position to be in, for Carter at the bottom of the line. I mean, I really empathize with that.
What does the 6th Plenum communique tell us about where Xi wants to take China? What can you learn by reading the People's Daily and writing a substack about it? And how would you design a course on how to read the CCP? In my first episode of a series on open source CCP, I'm welcoming
Manoj Kevalramani,
head of China research at the
Takshashila Institution
in Bangalore. Manoj is the author of the recent Smokeless War, China's Quest for Geopolitical Dominance, and writes the fantastic Substack, Tracking People's Daily at trackingpeoplesdaily.substack.com. I'm Jordan Schneider, your host. Manoj, welcome to China Talk.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you so much for having me here. At the moment you said the name out of the Substack aloud, I realized that I'm not really creative when it comes to naming Substacks.
You know, we're trying to give the audience what they want. On China Talk, we talk about China. The 6th Plenum communique. What is it and why does it matter?
So 6th Plenum is, as it says, it's the 6th plenary meeting. It's the 6th annual meeting. It's not annual per se, but it's the 6th meeting of the party central committee, which happens, usually they meet 6 or 7 times between the different Congress. A Congress is a 5-yearly meeting of the Central Committee, the top leadership of the Communist Party of China. And then over the period of those 5 years, these folks meet every year, sort of, sometimes more than once in a year. And each of those meetings is called a plenum. Each of those plenums address a certain topic generally. They may not be thematically designed, but they tend to sort of work out in that way where there's a certain theme that gets addressed. So this was the 6th plenary meeting of the 19th Central Committee, which came into being in October 2017. And it's really useful because this is the one that's heading into the 20th Party Congress, which is next year. So you're going to see lots of political wrangling that is potentially taking place behind the scenes, or just to get the folks in place who will be in charge of the party after the 20th Party Congress in October.
So this is the sort of biggest opportunity for, party bigwigs to get together and hash things out before we have, the big one in early 2022, where we get to see what's happening with Xi for the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think this is the start of that process. It's sort of a key, I would sort of look at it as a starting point of that process. I think this wrangling is going to go on over the course of the next year. Again, this is what we understand based on what's going on. It's really difficult to make out actually how these things play out.
So you argue that this communique was all about creating a linear history of the party's rule, whitewashing all of the turbulence and friction that was experienced over the past decades. So, before we get into the whitewashing, why even do a history review in the first place? Why is she so focused on this?
Yeah, I think the one thing that we've learned over the years in terms of the politics of China is that the past is not really about the past, right? The past is about the present and the future. It was the case, this was the case when the first sort of history resolution was passed in 1945, and then the second resolution in 1981 under Deng Xiaoping, which spoke about sort of left errors and, Mao's mistakes. And then this is about this one also. It's not about the past. It's not about sort of looking at history as a historian would look at it. They're not sort of going through history with a fine tooth comb, trying to come up with facts. What they're trying to do is they're trying to build a narrative which consolidates power, which consolidates authority within certain individuals who can then sort of dictate the policy direction going forward. This was the case in 1945 and 1981, and I think this is the case right now. Why I say that this is about a linear sort of creation of history is because from Xi Jinping's point of view, he's not really trying to shift the party's policy direction in a certain way, like say Deng Xiaoping was, away from what had been established as the party's direction under Mao. He's basically saying, I've been in charge for 9 years now. I've been running the show. I've done really well. I've sort of consolidated the party's authority, which was weakening. And I've set forth a direction which is based on my thought, Xi Jinping thought. And that's the way that we need to go. But in order to sort of further strengthen his position and the party's position, because he feels that the party needs to have a much stronger base, much stronger sort of interventionist approach to policy making and in institutions of state across society to achieve whatever he sees are his national strategic objectives. Therefore, he needs to sort of craft this story of where the party has come from, how it has constantly been sort of motivated by this single-mindedness of serving the people, of national rejuvenation and all of that. And that's the story that he's telling you right now through this history resolution. So the idea is to sort of frame the thought process for the Chinese public and for the world at large about the party's sort of prescience in some way, that it's going to continue, it's had this strategic vision, and it sort of makes it an inevitable choice that, don't look to deviate away from the party even as we grow further, as China grows richer. You stay with us because we know what we're doing, and we've been knowing what we're doing for the last 100 years.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. I spent the past 2 weeks sort of reading Deng Era Wranglings, this fantastic book by Ran Ming, who was Hu Yaobang's speechwriter, going over the Deng's historical decision. And my takeaways for that were that sort of like the CCP was much more opening to admitting mistakes. And I think, it's 1981. The whole country had lived through, not only the Great Leap Forward, but also the past 10 years, where you can't really blame, natural disasters on the Cultural Revolution. It was entirely sort of party created. So, you had this really interesting sort of balancing act that Deng had to do in the first few years when he was consolidating power, while saying, on the one hand, look, Mao Zedong thought is their thing. Mao Zedong was like a mess, and when he got older, he completely ran this country into the ground. But don't give up on the CCP, everyone. There are all these lines where he's like, the CCP, we're new to this. We've only been running the country for 25 years. A lot of things in sort of like Marxist theory don't necessarily apply anymore. So we're sort of like, feeling it out as we go. And of course, we're going to make some mistakes. But even though Mao's wrong, like the whole sort of theory of what the party is doing and, rule by the proletariat and whatever is still worthwhile. While, you argue, and I agree with you on this one, Manoj, is that like because his sort of like reference point of governments is longer, it's like easier and you're further away from the gravest mistakes of the party, right? That you can sort of airbrush this stuff out, and it's almost easier to kind of tell that sort of airbrush story of like victory upon victory.
I sort of partly agree with you, but I also see that, I think a lot of this is just sort of papering over some really great mistakes. I mean, 2020, starting of the pandemic was a serious structural flaw in how the party manages affairs. Even if you sort of, I don't want to sort of get into the pandemic controversies lest I go down a rabbit hole that I can't walk myself out of. But, if you also look at Chinese foreign policy, and over the past few years, it's been a conscious effort to make a set of, sort of to antagonize everybody around. And there has been zero reflection, at least from what we can see in terms of what's being said in speeches, what's being reported, what the editorials of the People's Daily, anywhere. You just see absolutely zero reflection. And even in this communique, if you look at it, they talk about the external environment becoming much more difficult and much more grave. Yet they absolutely shrug away any sense of responsibility for that happening. And I think, so it's not just that he has a longer frame where he can sort of, paper over mistakes and he can sort of create a narrative which says, which shows that there's been a clear-headed vision that they worked out on. It's also the case that he's saying that we are basically making no mistakes, which is deeply problematic, there are just some of these fleeting moments where you can see that, sometimes you see him making a mistake. For example, when he announced, when you had this, communique out in August about common prosperity, and then you had an essay published by Shi and Chu. You saw him talking about not pursuing common prosperity like we pursued poverty alleviation. So don't think of concrete targets, because that can create some of the problems of corruption, data reporting and all of that. So that's a sort of fleeting recognition of there are some chinks in what we do. But otherwise, it's all like, look, we've got a plan. We implement it well. We are awesome.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there's a real risk where if you paint the system as being perfect, like at a certain point, you will potentially end up running into something which is sort of unignorable. And I think that was what happened in February of March of 2020. Of course, sort of, there's a debate to be had about whether or not the sort of next 18 months of like controlling COVID sort of allows you to properly atone for your sins, so you don't have to talk about it in a plenum communique. But sometimes she does this thing where he talks about like we're in it for the long haul and we have like another long march ahead of us and things are going to be tough and difficult. But like that, that line of thinking in the most prominent document released of the year was not there at all. Which I think is interesting in that, and it sets you up for like, okay, if something does really go wrong and say you have a real financial crisis or what have you, not sort of laying the groundwork for things not always being going swimmingly is potentially even a higher risk rhetorical strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a sort of dichotomy in here in how they approach it. So the plenum does talk about cadres being modest and keeping a sense of danger around the horizon and keeping on with that and being sort of ready. But it's a fleeting mention towards the end. A lot of it is laudatory and celebratory in terms of what's been achieved. But I think that there's also this case that at one level, you do see yourself, and I sort of see the argument that Xi Jinping is making here, and I probably even agree with it to a certain degree, which is that he does see the world around him, and he looks at China's economic might, its ability to innovate, its military capacity, all of which is historically at its highest than it's ever been. And so that gives you a lot of confidence to do what you want to do. He also sees the world around him, and he does see that there is a West which is declining. He sees a sense of power sort of shifting towards the East. He sees the sort of world order in flux. So that creates the opportunity where, we have space to experiment abroad. We have space to experiment at home. There is tremendous risk, but we have great opportunities. So let's not get overawed by the risks. And that's the sort of argument that he's making. He's like, yes, you need to keep things in mind. You need to be wary, but don't get overawed by the risk. And I think one of the other things that he's saying when he's saying all of this is that one thing that the last couple of years have in particular shown us, which is the Communist Party of China, is that we don't sort of need to take a backseat to anybody anymore. We've done better than anybody would have imagined. We've sort of beaten all the odds in some way. And you don't need to take a backseat to anyone. You don't need to even talk about, changing the banner and, sort of doing any of that. Don't look to the West for solutions. And I see part of that is ideological, but part of that is really pragmatic. And I sort of, again, I see the logic of what he's saying, because he's basically saying that, look, our problems going forward are not problems for which we have templates that we can pick up like we could in the past and sort of adapt them a little bit. We need to devise new forms of governance, whether it's for technology, whether it's for algorithms, whether it's for innovation, or whether it's for urbanization at this scale, and pollution at this scale, all of that. We need to do our own thing, and we need to do it in a way that works from our point of view. So I sort of see all of that he's saying from a policy point of view. The idea is, I think that they've identified a lot of things correctly. My quibbles with what they do is actually how the sort of policy solutions they devise to address some of these issues.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a very confident document, as you say. I mean, there's this quote you highlighted: "We must not be intimidated by any risks or be led astray by any distractions. And we must be absolutely certain that we make no catastrophic mistakes on fundamental issues."
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of those things where, you see there is clearly anxiety that, in making the kind of changes that you're making, you can end up sort of making serious mistakes, which can have tremendous sort of damage, not just to business, but sort of social stability issues also can come up. But at the same time, if you look at some of the other documents that come out and some of the other speeches that Xi Jinping's given, I think in early September, he spoke at the party school. He he told the cadres that, you need to, be careful and all of that. But at the same time, he's saying that, look, we don't need to necessarily fear failure. So I think there's also a recognition that the top-down model that he's engineered means that there is less experimentation. And at a time when you need to have more experimentation, structurally, you're inhibiting it. So it does a lot of mixed messaging. If I'm a cadre sitting somewhere in Guangzhou or somewhere else, I'm wondering, what on earth does he really want me to do? And how do I climb this ladder while being cautious, not making catastrophic mistakes, yet experimenting? So it's a really difficult position to be in, for Cardin at the bottom of the line. I mean, I really empathize with that.
Yeah, I mean, because on the one hand, he's pushing all this, we're at a historical moment. This is the 100 years. This is the most like kind of dynamic time the world has ever gone through. But like, don't screw it up.
Yeah. And that's a terrible position to be in. If you're in your job and that's the message that you're getting from your boss, that's a terrible position to be in.
Anything else on the 6th Plenum?
I mean, I just thought that it was fascinating that, after the communique said, I mean, we still don't have the resolution, so we don't know exactly what the resolution says. So my comments on whitewashing history are sort of dependent on what essentially comes out in the final resolution. But I also thought that it was interesting that once the plenum was held, the next day, the People's Daily had this wonderful article which had, a reporter talking to different cadres who were at the meeting at the plenum. And most of these folks who were responding were provincial secretaries, and they were all essentially sort of kissing the ring, saying that Xi Jinping's awesome and Xi Jinping's the man, and he's the guy to lead us forward. He's the new helmsman. And this giant ship has to be steered by him. So there was a lot of, cadres coming out and saying, tipping their hat to the boss and saying, come next year, keep me in mind. And I think that's a fascinating process that plays out in public.
So anyone who's going to talk about a People's Daily article as delightful is a special kind of China watcher, and one that we love and respect here at China Talk. Before we get into why you started this project of writing, 2,000 plus words each day about what's going on the front page of the People's Daily, Manoj, what is the People's Daily?
Right. So the People's Daily is the Central Committee's mouthpiece. It's the highest organ of public propaganda that exists in China. And it's the sort of definitive media entity that exists in China. And why it's important is basically because you will sort of get a glimpse into as much as you can into the thinking that's going on at the highest levels of the party elite. You'd also probably, at better times, you saw sort of glimpses of friction between the party elite, if you could sort of pick out the little nuggets that were published and, when things were published, what was the language used and so on and so forth. But from sort of the currently, it enjoys a certain hegemony over the entire media ecosystem in China. So it sets the tone for what you're seeing in the rest of the media ecosystem. That's not to say that there aren't sort of other actors who sort of float around with other things. That's not to say that there aren't market dynamics at play with other actors that we see on, say, social media in China. But this is your sort of definitive source to understand what the central leadership is thinking, as much as they would like you to understand.
Gotcha. So what is this project, and what motivated you to start it?
Right. So I sort of started this last year. Substack I started early this year, but last year when I was working on my book, I wanted to look at, what is the discourse coming out of China with regard to the pandemic. And around sort of March, April 2020 is when I sort of religiously woke up in the mornings, started to look at the People's Daily and started to sort of navigate through the pages and figure what's going on. And I used to do a small blog at that point of time, just basically looking at pandemic-related content in the People's Daily. As sort of time went on, it became a habit, essentially, that I would wake up and, you find it strange that I used to wake up and if I didn't go through the People's Daily one day, my day sort of felt like it was meaningless. It felt empty. So I wanted to just wake up and do that. It was sort of addictive in a way.
So Manoj, some people wake up, they meditate. Some people wake up, they take a walk. Some people wake up and they pray. And I think all those things, they start your day off on different tones. Like, what has doing this done to your brain?
That's a good question. I think one thing that's happened is that it's altered sometimes. It has altered my appreciation of organizational dynamics, whether it is within my organization, Takshashila, or whether it is in other institutions. I tend to sort of see most organizations top down. So I need to sort of step back and look at organizations and say that, okay, look, this is functioning differently. So that's the one thing that's for certainly happened. And secondly, I mean, in a way, if you go through Chinese media in general, official media across the board, um, if you look at media, say in the West, if you look at media in India, it's chaotic. It's sort of scattered. It's all over the place. Somebody's shouting from one direction, another person's shouting from another direction. There's a Twitter fight going on, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the Chinese official media system, it's extremely orderly. And that's sort of, in some ways, it's really simple, therefore, to go through, to navigate through, because the structure is so orderly. So when I then sort of step back and look at the Indian media ecosystem, which I used to be a part of for over a decade, I end up sort of finding it really, it's really disconcerting. It's really disorienting to then look at normal media ecosystem. So that's the one thing that probably it's done. I've sort of enjoyed the order, which is blasphemous for a former journalist to say.
So it's actually it is meditative in its own way, right? In that you're just getting like a coherent view of the world and what matters and what's important, even though what matters and what's important just happens to be Xi visiting some farm in Anhui province every other day.
Absolutely. It's a simpler time in some ways.
Well, I don't know. I see those clips of the Chinese, of like Indian news media, and like there's like 18, things blinking on the screen, and 45 panelists all yelling at each other at the same time, and it is kind of like a
we're Fox on steroids.
You alluded to earlier the fact that the People's Daily is like what the party wants you to see. So how much can what can and you can't learn from an exercise like this or a practice like this that you've been engaged in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that increasingly the thing that I've learned is that there are certain things that I derive when I go to the People's Daily. I'm not going there for news per se. I'm not going there because the front page doesn't really tell you anything about what's happening in the world or even what's happening in China. I mean, you could have had a massive flood. You could have had, a blast somewhere. You could have had anything that's happened, which would make the front pages of newspapers in most places around the world. And, the People's Daily will still sort of, if it's sort of, say, winter time, you might still get a picture of lovely snow, and you might get sort of Xi Jinping plastered across the front page. So you don't necessarily go there for news. It doesn't sort of give you that. What you go there for is essentially what the top leaders are doing and saying. What is it that what's on their agenda? You also go there for what's the sort of ideological tone that's being set. So if you looked at the past year, a lot of the sort of focus was on the history learning campaign that was being run. And you sort of saw the introduction of much more language which spoke about redness and red heritage and, all of that. So you sort of see that the tone of, the general tone of commentary is changing. You go there for a bit of an understanding of how the party is thinking through international affairs, how particularly sort of the most prickly issues of international affairs. You get a sense of what is the tone that's being set, which will then be sort of generally reflected in what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would then be talking about, or even commentaries in the media. So you get a sense of the party's priorities, political priorities, economic priorities, the sort of ideological line that the party wants to set, based on which you'll see policy formulations coming down the road. But you won't necessarily, I don't necessarily go there to look at sort of granular things about, say, social policy, economic policy, and things like that.
Gotcha. So there was a recent Bloomberg piece talking about how the Biden administration was frustrated that they don't understand Xi's intentions. Do you think Jake Sullivan should be reading, if not the People's Daily, at least your newsletter on a daily basis? Or is this type of thing kind of like dangerous in untrained hands who don't understand the sort of caveats that you just laid out about what party propaganda can and can't tell you?
Yeah, I think it is. So I would sort of caveat this by saying this. If Jake Sullivan would like to read my blog, that'd be really cool. It's free subscription. So that's awesome. But I mean, I think that, I, there is a need to sort of understand, because the language can often be quite boastful. It can be quite sort of, you know, it can be quite, the language can sort of glorify a lot of things. And so in that sense, it may sort of create certain issues. The language can also be really, really difficult, because discourse in China, there's a certain language of discourse in China, which I sort of can't put my finger on to explain. But, when you're talking about, say, economic policy, or say currently they've been having these conversations about common prosperity, I think if people were reading the People's Daily, and if they're reading the sort of official media narrative, the understanding of common prosperity would be very, very different from, say, reading a Bloomberg piece about Lee Kuang-man sort of talk about profound revolution, because that's not what necessarily the parties say. So I think that, if you actually read the People's Daily, there is a bit more tempered understanding of what's going on than just relying on, say, social media sort of things, or, people sort of talking here or there, because you get a sense of where the party's going. And it may not necessarily be that the party or the central committee has clarity of thought. And there are times where you will see that lack of clarity of thought play out in commentaries, play out in pieces. And that's what sort of, the more you read, the more you sort of start to pick up on the nuances. I don't think it's necessarily dangerous in an untrained hand, but I think that the more you read, the deeper you sort of go down that road, the more sort of nuances you start to pick up. And, subsequently, depending on how you interpret things. Because again, nobody has a monopoly on interpretation. And it's really difficult. I can't sit here and I can say that I know that because this was said, this is exactly what they're going to do. So interpretations may differ, but I think you'll be in a far better position than just looking at random things here and there. Or, for that matter, looking at the global times.
Fair. How do you think the Xi era People's Daily ranks in entertainment value to previous People's Daily eras?
Oh, I think it's far more boring than anybody would sort of assume. It can be incredibly boring. There's absolutely nothing that's exciting. I mean, there are moments where, you'll find a piece which, like, say, for example, earlier this year, there was some talk about, pushback against wolf warrior diplomacy. Xi Jinping had again spoken to party cadres, and it said something about, creating an image of China that is lovable. And at the same time, there was a commentary, very long sort of commentary on the theory page of the People's Daily, which mentioned Zhou Enlai's diplomacy in the 1950s, where he expanded China's circle of friends. And, when I was reading through that, my first thought was that, is this sort of veiled criticism? Is this sort of somebody telling Xi Jinping that, you need to go back to far more personable diplomacy rather than what you're doing right now? But the other interpretation, which I think is probably much more accurate, was that, this was basically saying that we need to focus on the developing world much more, which I think subsequently, propaganda and policy sort of suggests that's where that's going. So it's really tricky to sort of pick up, but it's really, in a nutshell, it's quite dry. The Xi era People's Daily, it's quite dry, but it's also, there may be sort of moments of intrigue and interest that you may find in there.
So from your perspective, entertainment value equals like windows into party infighting. But for me, entertainment value also equals just like random weird things you learn about the party. For instance, you highlighted that Xi went to Hebei a little while ago, and it highlighted that like in his dinner, he had simple home cooked dishes, but also no alcohol. Who knew that was like the cool thing to do in party meetings now, is to not drink? You saw the CCP talking about how they're, reforming legal, the legal system, and how apparently standardizing packaging for food deliveries also is something that they're excited and bragging about. Though I remember like the most exciting things about getting Waimai in China was like that every dish had its own special thing. So like the jiaozi had like individual jiaozi holders and whatever.
No, I was just going to say that, I thought that alcohol bit was really, really surprising because, in India, we've got a history, political history with regard to alcohol. So, in a state or so, it's prohibited, and we've got all of that. And in the US also, you've got a history with alcohol and prohibition. But so there is a sort of public perception. I have never in my entire time living in China dealing with folks from China had this sense that alcohol has any stigma, or, even if somebody wants to portray themselves as this simple-minded, good-natured fellow, that alcohol has a role to play with it. Alcohol has always been celebrated. And I mean, I remember the same day that that particular piece came out, I saw on Twitter folks posting images of Xi Jinping drinking with David Cameron. And I was like, I just don't see why that was put in there. And, sudden need to project him as this ascetic saint of some sort was really, really strange.
A bit of a non sequitur, but I think it was in Peter Martin's book. He had a line about how Zhou Enlai used to put baijiu on his ice cream. Anyways, take that for what you will. Manoj D, what is your take of the kind of overall quality of open source, like CCP document driven research outside of China today?
Yeah, I think it's really poor. I think it's a really underexplored area. And one of the reasons why I say I was looking, when I started eventually putting this out as a blog, and initially I used to spend like an hour a day when I started this, but today I spend about 2.5, 3, sometimes 3.5 hours a day going through different things. And that's just basically because I increasingly realized that in India, there is very little focus on what the party is saying about itself and to itself. We aren't necessarily looking at that. And my sense is that in the West, particularly in the US, there's far greater focus on that, but still it's insufficient. And there has been some move in the US that I understand that, Congress has been looking at some sort of support for open source work and translation of documents. But there's so little that we do with so much that's available. And I think there's so much more scope to do. And this is just official newspapers and publications and, so documents that the party is putting out. But there's so much more. There's so much more analysis by, Chinese academic scholars, which we don't look at all. And I think that's a seriously untapped area, because part of the problem also is that if you're only looking at official readouts and official publications, even just the People's Daily, you miss the diversity of thought that exists in China. And you start to believe that there is just there's a hegemony of thought and there's a unified thought and everything works according to that, which is not necessarily true. I mean, there's clearly much more debate than we assume that there is. It's just that it takes place in forums that none of us seem to want to access, even though it may be accessible.
Yeah. And it's a few things. One, people are lazy, and even if you have Chinese, this is like not the Chinese that you learned, and it's a it's like a whole other level of vocabulary. Manoj, like you talked about the sort of like boringness quotient that folks have to get over. But it's also there's not like a business model for doing this, in that both in academia, like in undergrad, you can major in political science, you can major in history, you can major in international relations, but even like a China studies degree will not let you take 12 courses on like how to do this, right? So anyways, I'm trying to sort of formulate the idea of, formulate like what the sort of like Coursera version of this is, and maybe we'll find a funder and put it out for free or what have you, and have Manoj, do a 10-part lecture series. But before we get into that, like, how did you build this? How did you personally build this muscle?
I think it was just consistency. Let's start looking at one thing and doing it on a regular basis. I'd be the first person to admit that my language skills leave so much more to be desired. You've got your language skills, you can keep upskilling. You've got tremendous machine translation tools, which can do really good work to at least give you a gist of what's being said. And as you sort of do things more consistently, you sort of start to get a sense of the cadence of the documents. What are the purposes of different sections? Why certain changes are relevant? Why certain changes are not relevant? Which documents matter more than the others? So you start to sort of pick up that. The other thing that I think is important, and a lot of this gets sort of why this open source work is tricky and difficult, is that it's not just language. It's not just understanding the Chinese political ecosystem and political economy. It's also having a sense of strategic affairs. It's also having a sense of how bureaucracies work. It's also having a sense of how international relations work. And I think that's sort of really, really useful. A lot of work in this sense happens in silos, where people are Chinese language experts who are translating these documents, yet they don't necessarily have the sense of political economy or, elite competition to be able to interpret them. At the same time, you will have people who maybe have that sense, but don't have a sense of how bureaucracies work, because bureaucracies largely are motivated by fairly similar interests across the board. There are obviously differences in different systems, but at a certain level, there are similar interests, of bureaucrat wanting to go up the chain. There's professional interests, there's personal interests, and so on and so forth. And then you've got sort of strategic affairs to look at why some things are being done within the broader context of changes taking place between countries in the world order and so on and so forth. So I think that's the sort of holy grade for me. That's what I'm trying to sort of get myself towards, when I can sort of bring some sort of a mixture of these different skill sets.
Okay. That all sounds great, but that was very abstract. What is the 12-week course that gets folks, started on this as a practice?
Okay, so the first thing that I would want to do is, I think the first session would just be to understand what are the different departments that exist within the Communist Party and the state system, to just get a sense of which are the ministries, which are the departments, which are the important positions that need to be controlled by an individual, by the general secretary or whoever, to be able to wield power effectively. First get that sort of framework in place. After that, we look at the ecosystem of, the policy ecosystem. So you get a sense of which department does what. The first session would be about which are the keys to control power. The second is who does what. What is the role of the Ministry of State Security or Ministry of Public Security? What is the role of SAMR? What is the role of the Cyberspace Administration? What is the role of the State Council, for that matter? And what is the propaganda department? How is all of this structured? And what are the sort of roles of each of these entities and how they sort of have an interplay with each other? After that, I'd sort of look at the media ecosystem, because I think the propaganda element is extremely important. Just have a sense of the media ecosystem. Again, who controls what, which, because there are different, publications focused on different issues, right? You've got the People's Daily, you've got Economic Daily, you've got Security Times, you've got Study Times, you've got all of these different entities which are doing different things. What is the sort of authoritative nature of each of them? And what do you go to for what? So, if you're going somewhere for a sense of economic policy, you go to these elements. If you're going somewhere for theoretical understanding, you go to Churchill, you go to People's Daily. So, a breakdown of that. Then we come to sort of what are the kinds of documents that you want to look at, right? So you want to look at one level, speeches of the leader. That's important. So the speeches given by the top leadership is the first thing that I would look at. I would also look at readouts from Politburo meetings and Politburo study sessions, or the PSC meetings, the PSC sessions. So that's again, because those are your documents, those are your comments which are going to guide policy, which are going to set the frame for where things need to go. Then we come down to, say, guidelines or opinions which are issued, which are usually issued at the highest level by the Central Committee and the State Council together. These are really long, somewhat abstract, some often very repetitive, boring documents, but they're really, really useful, because if you just look at them structurally, there's a bit of a preamble after which you have something called guiding ideology, which you'll never find something like that in, say, the American system or the Indian system, where, the highest authorities are issuing something which says that your actions need to be guided by XYZ ideology. But that tells you a little bit about the power dynamics within the party. It tells you a little bit about the approach that the party is taking to policy going forward. And then you have sort of principles that this document needs to meet, or the policy in this domain needs to meet. And then you'll sort of have specific goals and targets, which, I'm saying specific, but they can be quite abstract, because it'll be like, by 2025, we need to get here. And by 2035, we need to be the best at this domain, and we need to have achieved everything, and the world will be civilized, and everybody will be happy. And, so it sort of goes in the direction. And then you have the pathways to get to that place, And again, these are fairly at sort of high level of abstraction, where it'll be like, well, okay, to be able to achieve carbon peak, carbon neutrality, or to be able to maintain supervision with regard to the implementation of carbon peak targets, we need to use AI for supervision. We need to use technology. We need to use this and we need to use that. So you see sort of pathways without necessarily clear direction in terms of what do they imply for policy. For that, you come to sort of one level lower. You get, you have obviously laws which are eventually passed, but you also have, regulations and rules issued by different departments, sometimes together, sometimes individually, who are all interpreting these abstract guidelines and sort of creating specific ways in which they want to achieve these guidelines. So I think the latter half of your 12-week course is where I would focus this on.
Gotcha. And what would your like homework assignments be? Like, how do you bite off like a manageable portion of all of this?
I think there are different things. Again, I would sort of want them to look at different things, and I would want them to come up with different sort of solutions. So I'd sort of want some assignments would be essentially to look at sort of elite politics and political implications of what's being said. So if you're reading through, say, speeches by Xi Jinping or, speeches by other senior leaders, or if you're reading through readouts from Politburo meetings, I would want you to sort of look at the dynamics of elite politics. What's the kind of message that's being sent? Because often this communication is not just to the cadre, it's also external signaling. So what's the signals that you're deriving out of that? And that would be one of the approaches that I'd have. I'd also want them to sort of look at, if you look at some of these fairly high-level abstraction guidelines, then I would want them to take that and go and look at what the different departments, ministries have said, how they've interpreted these. Sometimes they've interpreted these very differently, and how they've then gone about and implement, sort of create a flow chart of what was said and how it was interpreted and what was the eventual outcome in terms of, on the ground. And if you can sort of create that flow chart, that's a really, really excellent sort of takeaway, because you then understand. Because a lot of this is, like we discussed earlier, where Xi Jinping talks about taking risks but not making catastrophic mistakes. A lot of this is very mixed signaling, and how people interpret and then sort of devise policy and then go about implementing it is where the real sort of meat of the matter lies. So I'd want folks who are studying this to be able to make that connection and to see where things move in translation, how local interests play a role in them being adapted, and so on and so forth. Local interests, bureaucratic interests, and so on and so forth.
If you are a funder and care about understanding China and don't feel like waiting for Congress to create an open source research organization, which may or may not happen before 2027, get in touch, because I want to run this course and be able to pay Manoj to lead it. As he cracks up.
This is the first podcast that I've been on where I've been offered a job, and I'm really, really thrilled.
No, I mean, I think it's really important, because it's sort of sad that it's taking people. Well, there are two things that are sad. First, that like, this is not really a way, like doing this is not necessarily a way to support yourself. And that for the people who do this, a lot of them, it's like just for the love of the game. And this is, stuff you do in the morning or late at night, where you have your other job, which is like not necessarily focused on reading party documents. So that's like the one sad thing, which I don't think sort of like one Coursera can fix. But in the meantime, to sort of fill that gap, there is like an appetite, I think, among young China watchers to be able to build this muscle to do this sort of stuff. But the resources just aren't there, which is a bit of a tragedy, especially just considering how important it is to, like, people always talk about, like, we need to understand China better. We're like, here is the path, and just like give people the fishing rod so they can go out to fish. And unfortunately, like academia and, the vast majority of the think tank world, I think, has largely failed in giving folks what they, the baseline understanding of the party that they need to do some of this really, really important work. And as you said, you're really not going to get it from journalists who, frankly, have to write, 5 articles a week and don't really have the time to do this sort of, this sort of like this sort of very detailed, slightly, not particularly sexy work of reading through these party papers and documents.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's also it's really important, but it's also double-edged sword. And I think that from increasingly China is becoming closed, and for people to go and do primary research, it's becoming increasingly more challenging. So at one level, this is a massively important resource for people to sort of go and use. At another level, it's also, the fact that because China is getting more closed, you need to sort of exercise this muscle much more while looking at data and policy implementation to be able to understand what exactly is happening in the country. Even then, just to get a sense of what's happening in the country, because without having boots on the ground, it's anyway going to be much more difficult. And as that sort of challenge grows, I think it's important for folks to, and again, conflict of interest, which you've made very apparent, it's important for folks to fund this sort of work because at the end of the day, if you sort of even drop this, then it becomes even more of a black box. And that then leads to just bad policy decisions, whether it's in the US or it's in India.
And it's particularly dangerous, I think, in an environment where people are always assuming the worst out of the CCP and Xi in particular. And sometimes that may be justified. Sometimes it won't be. But if your sort of bias is towards towards like this is like a aggressive expansionist power which is going to take over the world, and you have no other inputs which could potentially kind of check that as a sort of like operating paradigm, then you're just gonna fall into this sort of circle of confirmation bias, which is dangerous if you're actually wrong. Even more.
Yeah, I mean, even beyond bias, just structurally, any ecosystem, any sort of political ecosystem looks at the world from the prism of their own interests. So India looks at BRI from India's position, geographically, economically, geopolitically. And therefore we interpret BRI from that prism. Whereas if you look at what the party is saying about BRI, it's much broader. An outcome could be that, an outcome of those policies could be that it sort of creates the so-called string of pearls around India and so on and so that. That's possible, of course. So you need to be conscious and wary. But it's very different when you conflate that outcome, which could be unintended or intended, as the driver of the policy. That then leads to really faulty decisions at the end of the day. So I think that's also one of those things. It may not be that you may have a sense of bias about what Xi Jinping is doing or what the party is like, but it's also because you look at the world from your prism of your own interests without then looking at what is it that they are saying to themselves or how is it they are thinking about things. It can lead to sort of problematic policy decisions.
Manoj, thank you so much for being a part of China Talk.
Thank you so much for having me, Jordan. And if you do get somebody for the course, I'm up for it.
Before we wrap up today, we have one more edition of Jordan reading his mean iTunes reviews. Seldom relevant, mostly U.S. policy, 2 stars. I tried to give the show a chance. It seldom delivers. Jordan speaks with a glee in his voice, but there is nothing gleeful about the status of U.S.-China relations. Sorry, not sorry.
Unity is power， 心里拥抱着，燃着云变数码，政治恭喜二后一坨。那天中部气候是由我慢工出细活，让滑板街舞涂鸦 DJ 全都玩在一坨。老公硬币，老公忘了熬些不准咋了，喊高级高楼闪烁，这行是赛过。说的没错，如你所见，我就是人脉多，这满大街的哈死了，不至于双手在搓。老公硬币。 信不曾咋了。高起高楼高楼闪烁，这行是赛过，地是场所 C， 时间很宝贵，在这里强大你自己。但是对我听不见，传播我的事迹，到下个世纪要把故乡都成精。我说无暇不成追加。场面西餐日料最爱还是香菜，接着碳水杀戮快乐造成伤害，别让车贷放贷成为你的障碍，保持战斗状态。SUP 的塔图，也请陪我找马步，不可能就此打住思路。每当我新歌发布，想成每条大马路，关掉你的撸啊撸。想要住黄金屋得是个常青树，我从东方明珠山要到黄兴路，你拍胸脯做保证前得想清楚，一诺千金像个战士保卫长津湖。刚想赶走有个帮，你要改了，把你不是 C block， 你要改了，有个故乡斗争军，你要改了，孤立无限不正军，你要改了。电视上说 C， 时间很宝贵，在这里强大你自己。但是对我听不见，传播我的事迹，到下个世纪要把故乡都成精。我说无暇不成追加，把我雕像铸成金。可这无暇不成军。可我猜错的，我碰见了太多了。游戏的开拓者穿一身败破了。